They didn't think he would say it aloud. Bishop Noel Jones finally came forth with a confession that has shocked the whole religious community after decades of rumors, whispers, and unspoken tension behind the pulpit. He states, "This is the truth I've been concealing. I got divorced." Why did one of the most powerful bishops in contemporary ministry decide to speak up now? Why, according to sources, is this disclosure just the start of a much larger story? Hold on, because what you're going to hear is something that the general public was never meant to know. Bishop Noel Jones has long been a prominent personality in the fields of leadership, ministry, and religion culture on television. His sermons have inspired millions, packed stadiums, and generated heated discussions among Christians. But beneath the well-maintained suits, the international clout, and the well-manicured public persona, there has always been one tale he has resisted telling until the end. For the first time in his lengthy and complex journey, Bishop Jones is discussing a very personal chapter that many people thought he would pass away. The real story of his divorce, the reasons for it, and the effects it had on his life, ministry, and faith. However, this is more than just a tale of a failed marriage. It's about the emotional burden of attempting to live up to an image that the world expected him to maintain, as well as pressure, legacy, fame, and expectations. You'll hear moments that will cause you to pause, think, and reevaluate everything you believed to be true about life behind the pulpit, I promise. Even if his revelation was stunning, the reasons for it are what make the story genuinely implausible. Let's begin. We must get to the source of the actual conflict before we can comprehend Bishop Noel Jones's startling admission. This story begins with the world he was born into. Long before the divorce, long before the news media covered it, long before cameras followed him into private meetings and church offices. A society with more than just high standards, they could not be avoided. People viewed Noel Jones as more than just a preacher. As soon as he entered the ministry, he was viewed by them as a symbol of a generation, a man who was supposed to carry on a strong family name. There was a certain intrigue surrounding him because he was Grace Jones's brother. However, it also increased pressure in every relationship, choice, and sermon. Even though he didn't request one, it all came with a spotlight. The demands increased along with his power. Pastors weren't the only thing that congregations wanted. They desired a public figure who never wavered, never grumbled, and never broke beneath the imperfections of humanity. A leader, a counselor, a star, a spokesperson, a spiritual father. Furthermore, men are not the only ones who experience this kind of pressure. It comes home with him. Those closest to Bishop Jones observed the ongoing struggle between his personal life and his ministry behind closed doors. Church duties growing, ministries growing, and the psychological toll of trying to win over millions of people while losing parts of himself in the process. People never witnessed the nights he didn't sleep, but they did witness his public talks. They never heard the private disputes, but they did hear the strong signals. They never saw the stress taking place inside the house he had hardly had time to construct, but they appreciated the assurance behind the podium. And the distance increased along with the expectations. Separation from tranquility, separation from repose, separation from his former self. Anyone who has ever been placed on a pedestal will recognize this narrative. The lonelier the view, the higher the pedestal. However, this is when things begin to change. Because Bishop Jones was silently confronting a reality he wasn't ready to acknowledge, while the rest of the world witnessed a strong, poised leader, nor to himself, nor to the media, not to the church, a reality that would ultimately force him to make one of the most agonizing choices of his life. And that's where the cracks started to appear. What really altered things, however, was what transpired afterward. If the strain surrounding Bishop Noel Jones was revealed in Section 1, the disintegration of a marriage that many thought was impenetrable is revealed in Section 2, which he avoided talking about for years. At this point, the cost of leading two distinct lives began to emerge, and the public perception and private reality ceased to align. The ambiance in the house was different from the sermons people heard on Sunday mornings. What had once been a partnership started to feel like two persons living in different worlds, with one being consumed with ministry and the other feeling less and less visible. The family's close friends eventually admitted that the warning indicators existed long before anyone dared to recognize them. Missed meals, halted discussions, last-minute cancellations of plans due to meetings, emergencies, church problems, or unforeseen congregational travel. These interruptions appeared to be a sign of commitment. However, they established an emotional distance pattern inside the house that gradually grew into a wall. Bishop Jones had more than one spouse. He was wedded to the full burden of an international ministry, and all was required by that ministry: his time, energy, focus, attention, and even emotional capacity. After a while, nothing remained to offer. Seasons of drifting away don't start with loud debates or big disagreements, as anyone who has experienced them knows. Usually, they start with peaceful silences. Just two people gradually losing the version of themselves they once loved. No yelling, no fireworks. On certain evenings, one would stay up in the hopes of striking up a conversation, while on other nights, the other would return home too tired to make an effort. There were mornings when minor arguments were dismissed because they were both too exhausted to consider the true problem, and afternoons when the public's presence made them smile despite their own suffering. Many couples have to deal with this story. The time when connection is lost, yet love endures. Bishop Jones also had a deeper conflict as a result of this emotional isolation. The belief that a spiritual leader should always lead a flawless family. He was aware that thousands of people were watching him. He was aware that sermons about marriage and family commitment had a distinct impact when they were given by someone who was personally having difficulty maintaining his own home. And that's when guilt comes into play. A sense of guilt that increased with each sermon, handshake, and prayer for couples in need of mending. When your own home seems to be silently sinking beneath the surface, how do you lead people through storms? No one knew how much that question troubled him. The bishop made an effort. He did. Endeavors to re-establish contact that had deteriorated over time. To rebuild. To reconnect. However, when both parties feel they are losing themselves in the process, effort alone cannot rescue anything. Furthermore, no one saw Bishop Noel Jones enter a house that was tense, silent, and rife with unresolved anguish, even though the world saw him as a revered pastor, religious figure, and icon. The distance eventually becomes something he could not avoid. The initial turning point occurs at this point. The marriage had already ended when he discovered it wasn't just slipping. A choice was about to be made, one that would destroy the perception that others had of him. He prayed he would never have to make the decision that would permanently alter his life and ministry. Even those closest to him were taken aback by what he did next. Although there are difficulties in every marriage, Bishop Noel Jones's decision wasn't just another challenging one. It was the point at which every repressed feeling, every unsaid injury, and every disregarded warning indication at last erupted. And this moment seemed like the ground opening beneath his feet for a man who had dedicated his entire life to perfecting the art of keeping everything together. It was not one violent altercation. There was no loud yelling or slamming of doors. Rather, it took place at a silent moment, the kind of moment that most people ignore until it has a profound impact. Some claim that following a demanding day of ministry responsibilities, the breaking point occurred on a typical evening. There was a feeling that something had changed forever, but there was no disagreement or confrontation. Despite being in the same place, two persons felt very different from one another. What should have been a straightforward talk suddenly carried years of repressed fatigue. It was the knowledge that the version of themselves they were in the relationship no longer recognized. This was a terrible time for Bishop Jones. Leaders are taught to make things better. Pastors are trained to help people resolve disputes, reunite families, and mend what appears to be broken. The notion that he was incapable of repairing his own house therefore struck a deeper chord than any public censure could. He had helped innumerable couples find forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. He had spoken about love, perseverance, and the purity of marriage for years. Even yet, he experienced an unexpected feeling while he was in his own living room, beaten. It's the kind of defeat that results from embracing reality, not from failing. He tried everything, according to those close to him, including talks, therapy, time away, and spiritual re-evaluation. However, If two individuals pretend that everything is all right for too long, the lying eventually becomes a burden in and of itself. The facade starts to weigh more than the actual issue. Something that is rarely spoken in ministry circles started to happen to the bishop. Emotional exhaustion, not from traveling, not from preaching, not from leadership duties, but from attempting to keep a marriage that had silently disintegrated years before together. And the weight just got heavier with each attempt to make things better. In the meantime, his public life started to show the effects of his private suffering. Delivering sermons felt more difficult. Meetings seemed to go on forever. It felt heavy to travel. His public smile grew more and more contrived. He had the impression of a guy juggling two realities, the fact and the expectation, and the conflict between them grew intolerable. Then the thing that finally tipped him over the brink happened. According to sources, the talk was extremely emotional, calm, courteous, but brimming with years of unspoken reality. They both admitted what they had been reluctant to say. Neither of them was living because of the marriage. They weren't adversaries. They weren't upset, they were just worn out from trying to live up to the expectations of others. At that point, Bishop Noel Jones had to make a choice that he had been putting off for far too long. Should he stay in a marriage that was limping along on duty, image, and habit, or should he face the reality even if it means losing everything? Ultimately, he made the decision to be honest, the kind of honesty that entails repercussions, criticism, and unavoidable judgment. However, this choice was not taken lightly. He was aware that everything would alter the instant he said the word divorce. His image as a spiritual leader, his ministry, his connections, his influence, and his reputation. Nevertheless, he decided to speak. He opted for sincerity over public acceptance, truth over perception, and healing over pain. However, nobody anticipated the impact of the news when it was revealed, not even those closest to him. Because of what transpired following the divorce announcement, a private decision became a public upheaval. This is the point at when the plot drastically changes. Bishop Noel Jones knew there might be repercussions when he decided to get a divorce. He was surprised at the size of the response though. The announcement would divide the religious community into two emotional groups, spark controversy on social media, and reverberate throughout congregations. Instead of being a peaceful, private step toward recovery, he was met with a barrage of scrutiny, rumors, and criticism that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Discussions broke out everywhere within hours of the news. Astonishment and disappointment were the reactions of some, while many, far too many, replied with harsh judgment. A few showed support. People seemed to have forgotten that he was a human being who could be hurt, broken, and in need of more than public recognition. His integrity was questioned by some. Critics questioned his credentials. His religiosity was questioned by strangers. Even worse, some people questioned if he still had the authority to lead. Most preachers never discuss this portion of the tale, what it's like to speak your truth and be condemned by the very people you've spent years encouraging, mentoring, and praying for. Bishop Jones had witnessed others go through it, but now he was going through it himself. In the meantime, the mood changed inside the cathedral. Unsure of how to balance their expectations with the circumstances, a few members withdrew. Others vigorously defended him, reminding detractors that pastors are also human beings, with flaws and imperfections who struggle in private. However, there were 10 more people willing to point fingers for every encouraging voice. There were rumors going around, unfounded assertions, stories that were embellished for amusement, and conjectures that were repeated as fact. Bishop Jones became aware for the first time of how easily a private truth may be turned into a public spectacle. He continued to remain silent, not because he was hiding or terrified, but because he thought that the most respectable way to deal with a storm that was driven more by ideas than by understanding was to remain silent. However, the emotional strain that accompanied the backlash was not alleviated by his silence. He battled guilt behind the scenes, not because of the divorce per se, but rather because of the burden it caused on his congregation. He was concerned about letting people down. He was concerned about losing their confidence. He was concerned that people who only saw the surface and never the fight underneath would misinterpret him. He wondered if he ought to leave the ministry. He wondered if he had failed in some basic way because of the divorce. And during those silent times, he was confronted with a question he had shunned for years. When their own heart is broken, can a spiritual leader still be a leader? He underwent an unexpected change during this challenging season. Some of his most devoted followers, who had supported him for many years, reached out with compassion rather than condemnation. He really needed to hear what they told him, because being open and honest is not a sign of weakness or failure. Even leaders bleed, they reminded him. Pastors cry too. Icons also have their breaking moments. This support gradually allowed him to breathe once again. However, the reconstruction was just getting started because he still needed to address more profound spiritual and emotional issues in addition to the public's response. Inquiries that would ultimately lead him to the startling admission he just made, the one that shocked the religious community and reignited a debate that many believed he would never have again. And there was one last metamorphosis he had to go through before he disclosed that reality. An event that would reshape his identity as a man and as a preacher. Following months of introspection, silence, and personal conflict, Bishop Noel Jones came to a turning point in his life when he was unable to bear the pressure to appear unbeatable or to live up to public expectations. He was still regarded by many as a spiritual force, a towering presence, and a man whose thoughts had influenced generations. However, on the inside, he had entered a new phase, one in which vulnerability became the only way to genuine recovery, and honesty was more important than appearance. The pulpit was not where this change took place. It didn't take place in front of thousands of applauding supporters, during a sermon, or on television. It took place in a quiet, private area, with only a few reliable voices around him. Those who inspired him to speak. Those who reminded him that scandal is not the same as truth. It's freedom. He was informed by others that healing doesn't start when the outside world gets you. Knowing who you are is the first step. As a result, Bishop Noel Jones made no excuses when he eventually spoke. He placed no blame. He didn't use spiritual concepts or elegant language to conceal himself. Rather, he began with straightforward statement that shocked everyone who heard it. I chose to get a divorce because I didn't want to emotionally die in a marriage that had already failed us both. There was silence in the room. They did so out of honesty, not because they were shocked when he said it. He clarified that for him, getting a divorce wasn't a sign of disobedience or impatience. It was a survival tactic. He made the decision to prioritize his mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being over upholding an image that had been slowly killing him from the inside out. He acknowledged that he had spent years assuring himself that things would improve, persuading himself that hardship was a necessary part of the job, and thinking that leaders had to endure personal suffering. However, he acknowledged that he stayed much longer than he ought to have. He was scared of what people might think, not because the marriage was doing well, fearful of disappointing his congregation, of losing their respect, of being called a failure or hypocrite, of proving his detractors correct, and, above all, of acknowledging that he was still human enough to break despite all of his spiritual wisdom. He continued by disclosing the emotional cost. Going to bed feeling invisible, waking up spiritually exhausted, and pouring into millions with nothing left for himself. He talked about how marital loneliness can develop long before divorce papers are ever signed. The loneliness that murmurs rather than yells. The loneliness that gradually erodes a relationship's base. But grief wasn't the end of his confession. He went farther, concentrating on a more profound aspect. In his own words, he acknowledged that pastors are trained to bear the burdens of others. It takes courage for a leader to say, I need healing too, yet seldom granted authorization to carry their own. He disclosed that spiritual leaders experience an emotional seclusion that is invisible to the general world. They rarely have a place to bring their own troubles, but people come to them with theirs. They're expected to be strong, but no one ever inquires as to who gives them strength once the service is over. Listeners were astounded by this degree of vulnerability. It was uncooked. It was genuine. The church community seldom ever hears of it. Divorce, he clarified, was not the point at which he failed. It was the time he at last quit acting. He opted for truth over expectation, healing over fear, health over pressure, and honesty over appearance. The statement that further stunned everyone followed. the phrase that changed the entire discourse and went viral right away. I would have lost myself if I had stayed. Furthermore, God did not call me into ministry to blend in with a marriage that no one could comprehend. Everything was altered by that sentence. The story was reframed. Many detractors were silenced by it. It made empathy possible. It served as a reminder that religious leaders are not perfect representations of perfection, but rather human humans.